Hello everyone, my name is Chrissy and welcome to my channel. Summer classes are finally over and I can get back to making some content on my YouTube channel. Today I am bringing you my July 2022 wrap up. I managed to read 4 books in the chaos that is work, school, and taking care of the child. Let's get started. The first book I read is Lemon by Kwon Yosun. This fits more into novella at under 150 pages and it's translated work. It takes place in South Korea and it takes place in the early 2000s following what's known as the high school beauty murder. The first part of the book showcases what happens immediately after the murder. There are 2 suspects, one of them gets interrogated and gets to see that interrogation, and then there's a time jump 17 years into the future. This book is an interesting look at grief and also unmet justice. Because even though we have 2 suspects and we can kind of piece together the puzzle, for the most part we don't have straight answers to what happened. Instead, really, we're working through the changes of the 3 characters that we see. One of the characters, who's the victim's sister, is the one who goes kind of through the most changes. We see as her personality changes and also kind of her life trajectory changes. She makes decisions that if her sister wasn't murdered, then she probably wouldn't have made. Overall, I really liked this book. The only thing I had a little bit of quibbling with was that at the beginning, there's a little bit of confusion of whose point of view we're at because it switches between 3 characters, and one of the point of views is more of a dialogue conversation. So even though the character in that point of view is using I, me, and is being descriptive in action, she's still having conversation with someone, which gives a little bit of disjointedness but works well for the story. However, the confusion I'm talking about happens in the first chapter, maybe first 2 chapters, where the point of view shifts and it's in the same style. The point of view with the person talking to someone else, like on a telephone or a face-to-face conversation, is different in style from the other 2, which are pretty closely linked and sometimes hard to tell apart in the first few sentences of the chapter. I think if you're looking for something quick but emotional, this is a good book to read. The second book I read is Picture Imperfect by Cindy Proctor King. This is a suspense romance suspense. This book follows 2 characters. One is Ursula, who's a photographer who really just wants to get her start with her own business. And the second character is Gabe, who is an ex-cop from LA who is trying to become a private investigator. Gabe's uncle owns the studio where Ursula works, and she's trying her best to save up enough money to buy the studio from Gabe's uncle. There's a lot of odd pranks and kind of petty crimes that end up happening around the studio, and Gabe comes in to do an investigation. He does not tell Ursula or any of the other workers about his investigation. The only one who knows is his uncle. And so he is kind of undercover. During the course of this undercover work, Gabe investigates Ursula and a couple of the other workers at the studio, and thus begins our journey into this book. Overall, I found this book to be funny. I did think that the suspense was really interesting, especially because it builds up pretty well throughout the book. When we first start out, it's pranks, really superficial crimes like graffiti in the alleyways, that kind of thing. And later on, it becomes more serious. And I think the author does a good job of building up that suspense and the seriousness in the story. The biggest thing about this book is I did not like Gabe. I did not like him at all. And one of the reasons is because he's undercover, but he doesn't have a license to practice as a private investigator. He's on his way and he has to go apply for the licensure, but he doesn't have it yet. He's an ex-police officer from LA who's between jobs. And then he decides to do an undercover work, and he keeps referring to it as work, but he's not getting paid. He's doing it as a favor to his uncle in order to ease his mom's mind, because his mom's really worried about his uncle and what's going on at the studio. But Gabe, throughout the work, keeps reiterating, I have to do this for my job. I have to lie to everyone for work. And I'm just like, you don't. You really don't. You're not getting paid. You don't have a license. That's pretty much the biggest hurdle I had in this book, is that we have this character who went undercover when he didn't need to, and he very much has the everyone is suspicious and everyone is guilty until they're proven innocent. And I just didn't like that in the story. I liked the side characters, I liked some of the suspense stuff that was happening, but he was a little bit of a drag for me. However, if you like investigative romances, then this may be the book for you. I admit I was cheering Ursula on when she told Gabe off. I was like, go, go, go. The next book I read is The Burning God by R.F. Kuang. This is the 3rd book in the popular trilogy, and I'm not going to explain what this book is about, because if you haven't read the first 2 books, then me describing anything in this book is going to be a spoiler. And I do my best to keep my wrap-ups spoiler-free. If you do get into the Poppy War trilogy, just know that it is a fantasy based off of Asian history and Asian countries, and it very much is about war and drug use, poppy, opium, that kind of thing. The trigger warnings on this book is a long list. I'm going to put them in the description. I'm going to do my best to be as thorough as possible. It's not a book to read if you're squeamish. There's a lot of brutality in it. And oddly enough, that's one of the reasons why I like the book. It's not that I enjoy reading about brutality, but oftentimes in the fantasy I've read, it kind of doesn't really portray war as anything more than honor, duty, we must defend, and one person is always in the right. And in the Poppy War trilogy, I find that the reasons why these wars are happening and the reason why people are fighting is less about that kind of honor, though some characters do have that instilled upon them, but it's more about just surviving. The main character, Rin, throughout the whole Poppy War trilogy is just looking for a way to survive and a way to keep safe for later on in her life. She really just wants it all to stop and to get better, somehow, some way. But how it gets better and her part in it is entrenched in that stuff happening. Rin is definitely a character full of faults, and in fact, this book highlights those more than some of her qualities, which is actually something I like about Rin. If I had to give a critique about anything in this book, it's going to be about pacing. All three books are fast-paced in that you get a lot of stuff happening in short amount of time. I'll give an example of this, and this is going to contain minor spoilers in the Poppy War, and it's not like big horrendous spoilers that's going to ruin the book for you, but just beware. In the first book, when Rin goes to Singard, which is the military academy, I thought her time at the academy would take up the whole first book. It doesn't at all. It takes about the first half of the book, and then the next half is about the war that gets started. There's a lot that had happened in Singard before the war started, and I thought it would last that whole book. I really did. And then we get catapulted into this war that is even more fast-paced than her time at Singard. You kind of just don't really have a moment to see some of the softer sides of the characters. And the reason why that's a con is because later on, when there's these moments that should give big impact to your feelings, they kind of don't. It's kind of just like a shrug of, well, something bad was supposed to happen here anyway. So overall, I highly recommend this book to people who are not queasy in regards to things that happen in war, and who also really like fantasy. The last book I read is The Charm Offensive by Alison Cochrane. This is a rom-com. It's about this Bachelor-esque style reality show called Ever After. Charlie, who is the prince of the newest season in Ever After, is ill-fitted for the prince role. He's a little bit awkward, he has some anxiety issues and some other mental health things that kind of make interacting on the show a little bit difficult. And then there is Dev, who is the talent handler. So Dev works on the production team, and his job is to try to make Charlie look the best on camera. This book is really about the romance between Charlie and Dev. Instead of finding a princess, he finds a prince. For the most part, the book is pretty lighthearted, though we do see some mental health struggles from both Charlie and Dev. It's not a particularly spicy book, and if you're wondering, why are you calling it a spicy book? That is how we say how intimate the scenes play out. The intimate scenes between Charlie and Dev are pretty vague for the most part. I mean, you kind of have some idea of what's going on, but for the most part... Overall, I think it's a really sweet book. I actually think that this book could be turned into a movie pretty easily. In fact, I'm surprised it hasn't happened yet. And those are the books I read for July. Also, this is the first video wrap-up I filmed in a while, and there's a lot of editing that I'll have to do. Thank you so much for sticking with me. I hope to have a couple other videos filmed soon. By the way, if you have read any of these books, please tell me what your thoughts are, and if you have any recommendations, I am always glad to receive them. As always and forever, may get lost in a book.